Imagine you are 19 years old. You are standing in a hole in the ground, 4 feet wide, 8 feet deep, filled with freezing cold mud up to your knees. It is 3 in the morning. You cannot see your hand in front of your face. You haven't slept in 4 days. Your boots dissolved weeks ago because your feet have been wet for so long that the leather just fell apart. You have something called trench foot now. Your toes are black. The medic told you that in some cases they have to be cut off. The man to your left is 17 years old. He lied about his age to enlist. He still has acne on his face. Right now, he is shaking, not from the cold, but because somewhere in the darkness, 200 yards away, the enemy is there. And any second, a flare could go up, and both of you would be completely exposed. The man to your right was your childhood friend. You grew up on the same street in a small town in Pennsylvania. You joined the army together. You crossed the Atlantic together on a ship, standing on the deck, watching the ocean, and talking about how this was going to be the greatest adventure of your lives. And now, he's not moving. He hasn't moved in 6 hours, and you already know why. But you cannot look. You cannot look because if you look, something inside you will break. And if something inside you breaks, you will not survive the night. This is not Hollywood. This is not a movie with a hero and a happy ending. What you just heard, that is a real moment. Documented. Described in letters and diaries by real American and British soldiers. Young men, teenagers, who found themselves in a nightmare that their government, their generals, and their newspapers had promised them would never happen. They called it the Great War. The soldiers who survived it, they called it hell on earth. And by the time it was over, 10 million soldiers were dead, 21 million were wounded, and an entire generation of young men had been erased from the face of the earth. This is their story, and I promise you, by the end of this video, you will never look at war the same way again. Let's go back, all the way back. To understand how this happened, we need to understand the world before the war. Because the most shocking thing about World War I is not how it was fought. The most shocking thing is how it started, and how completely, totally, catastrophically wrong everyone was about what it was going to be. It is the year 1914. Europe is the most powerful continent on Earth. London is the capital of the largest empire in human history. The British Empire controls nearly a quarter of all land on the entire planet. Germany is an industrial powerhouse. Its factories, its steel mills, its science and technology are the best in the world. France is a center of art, culture, and military pride. And across the Atlantic, the United States of America is growing faster than any nation in history. For nearly 50 years, since the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, Europe has been at peace. Not a perfect peace. Not a calm peace. There have been tensions, rivalries, arms races, but no major war. No continent-wide catastrophe. And because of that, because of those 50 years of relative stability, most people in 1914 genuinely believed that a major war between the great powers of Europe was simply impossible, that the economies were too connected, that the leaders were too rational, that civilization had advanced too far. They were wrong. In every possible way, they were wrong. On June 28, 1914, in the city of Sarajevo, in what is now Bosnia, a 19-year-old Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip fired 2 shots from a pistol. Those 2 shots killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and his wife, Sophie. And those 2 bullets, fired by a teenager with a pistol on a street corner, triggered a chain reaction of alliances, ultimatums, and miscalculations that pulled every major power in Europe into the deadliest war the world had ever seen. Within 6 weeks, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized to defend Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia. Germany declared war on France. Germany invaded Belgium. Britain declared war on Germany. The Ottoman Empire joined Germany. and suddenly the entire continent was on fire. But here is what makes this even more tragic. When the war began, when the soldiers climbed onto trains in London and Paris and Berlin and New York, they were cheering, literally cheering. There are photographs of it. Thousands of young men, smiling, laughing, waving their hats, flowers pinned to their uniforms by their mothers and their girlfriends. In Germany, they wrote on the sides of the train cars, "Home before the leaves fall." In England, recruiting offices had lines around the block. In the first month alone, over 700,000 British men volunteered. Not drafted, volunteered. Why? Because every general, every newspaper, every politician told them the same thing. This war will be fast. It will be glorious. It will be like the wars of the past. Cavalry charges, heroic advances, quick victories. Everyone said it would be over by Christmas. It lasted 4 years, 3 months, and 14 days. And nothing, absolutely nothing, about it was fast, or glorious, or anything like the wars of the past. Because the generals of 1914 were planning to fight a 19th century war with 20th century weapons. And that combination, old tactics plus modern firepower, produced something that no human being had ever seen before, and no human mind was prepared for. It produced the trenches. By the end of 1914, both sides had realized something terrifying. Neither army could advance. Every time soldiers tried to move forward across open ground, they were cut down in seconds by machine guns. The machine gun had completely changed the mathematics of war. In previous wars, a soldier with a rifle could fire maybe 3 rounds per minute. A machine gun in 1914 could fire 600 rounds per minute. You do the math. So both sides did the only logical thing. They stopped trying to advance. They dug down. They dug trenches. Long, deep, winding ditches cut into the earth of France and Belgium. And they stayed there. And those trenches became, for hundreds of thousands of men, their entire world, their home, their prison, and, for many of them, their grave. Let me describe to you exactly what a World War I trench looked like, because most people picture something from a movie, and the reality was so much worse. A typical front-line trench was about 7 feet deep and 6 feet wide. The walls were reinforced with wooden planks and sandbags. The floor, if you could call it that, was usually covered in wooden boards called duck boards, laid on top of the mud to give soldiers something to stand on. Those duck boards were almost always partially submerged in water and mud. The trench was not straight. It was deliberately built in a zigzag pattern, so that if an enemy shell landed inside the trench, it would only kill the men in that one section, not everyone. Behind the front-line trench was a second trench, the support trench. Behind that, a third, the reserve trench. All connected by a network of smaller communication trenches running perpendicular to the front. And stretching out in front of the front-line trench, in the open ground between the two armies, was no man's land. That name says everything. No man's land was a strip of earth, sometimes 50 yards wide, sometimes 500 yards wide, covered in shell craters, barbed wire, mud, and the unburied bodies of men who had died trying to cross it. It was called no man's land because no living man could survive there for more than a few minutes in daylight. Now, let me tell you what it was actually like to live in these trenches. Not the strategic picture, not the big map view. What it was like for a 20-year-old kid from Iowa or Georgia or New York, standing in that trench day after day, week after week. The first thing that hits you, before anything else, is the smell. Every single soldier who wrote about the trenches described the smell first. It was a combination of things: rotting flesh, human waste, chloride of lime used to disinfect the latrines, wet mud, gunpowder, and smoke. That smell soaked into your uniform, your hair, your skin. Men who came back from the front on leave said their wives and mothers could not hug them, not because of emotion, but because the smell was physically unbearable. Even after bathing, even after weeks away from the front. That smell stayed with you. The second thing, the rats. The Western Front trenches were infested with two species of rat, the brown rat and the black rat. And these were not small rats. They fed on the bodies of dead soldiers in no man's land and in the trench walls, and they grew enormous. Some soldiers reported rats as large as cats. They would run across sleeping soldiers at night. They would eat through kit bags and rations. They would gnaw on the faces of the dead, and sometimes the faces of the living if a man was too exhausted to wake up. Soldiers tried everything to kill them, shooting them, stabbing them, trapping them, but for every rat they killed, 10 more appeared. One British soldier wrote in his diary, "The rats are the only ones winning this war." The third thing, the water. The trenches flooded constantly. The region of northern France and Belgium where most of the fighting took place, Flanders, had a clay soil that did not drain well. When it rained, and it rained constantly, the trenches filled with water. Not an inch of water, not a puddle. We are talking knee-deep, sometimes waist-deep, freezing cold water mixed with mud, human waste, and decomposing bodies. Soldiers stood in this water for days at a time, and that produced one of the most quietly horrifying medical conditions of the entire war. Trench foot. Trench foot happened when feet were wet and cold for extended periods. The tissue would begin to rot. The feet would swell, sometimes to 3 times their normal size. The skin would turn red, then blue, then black. In severe cases, gangrene set in, and gangrene meant amputation. Over 74,000 British soldiers alone suffered from trench foot during the war. The treatment, when there was treatment, was simply dry your feet, take your boots off, rub whale oil onto your skin. But in a trench that was flooded, where was a soldier supposed to dry his feet? But the physical conditions, as horrifying as they were not the worst part. The worst part was the waiting, because 90% of trench life was not combat. It was waiting, waiting in the mud, waiting in the dark, waiting for orders that never came, waiting for an attack that might come tonight, or might not come for 3 weeks. That waiting, that constant grinding psychological pressure of not knowing, destroyed men in ways that bullets and shells could not. There is a name for what it did to them. Today, we call it PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. In 1914, doctors called it shell shock. The Army did not treat it as a medical condition, but as cowardice. Shell shock presented in different ways. Some men went completely silent. They could not speak. They would open their mouths with nothing coming out. Others developed uncontrollable tremors, shaking that never stopped, even miles from the front lines. Some went completely blind, with no physical damage to their eyes, lost in their own darkness. Some men screamed in their sleep, every single night for months, haunted by unseen horrors. Others stopped responding entirely, sitting in corners, staring at nothing for hours, for days. What did the British Army do? They court-martialed them, calling them cowards and malingerers. In some cases, they shot them, believing they were pretending to avoid fighting. Between 1914 and 1918, 306 soldiers were executed for cowardice or desertion. Historians now believe many suffered severe shell shock. They were broken, not cowards, killed by their own army. If mud, rats, water, and psychological destruction weren't enough, another weapon emerged. A new, terrifying, cruel weapon changed warfare forever. With no defense when first used, poison gas, April 22, 1915, near Ypres. French and Algerian soldiers noticed something strange. A yellow-green cloud drifted from German trenches low to the ground, moving with the wind. Nobody knew what it was. Some thought it was smoke, others a malfunction. Some just watched it come. When the cloud reached the Allied trenches, soldiers began to die. Chlorine gas attacks the respiratory system. It combines with moisture in your lungs to form hydrochloric acid. It burns your lungs from the inside. Men described drowning on dry land. Their lungs filled with fluid. They could not breathe. They clutched their throats. They turned blue. Some died in minutes. Those who survived were blinded, or suffered permanent lung damage that killed them years later. Within seconds, 10,000 Allied soldiers broke and ran. That is not a criticism. That is the only rational human response to suddenly being unable to breathe, with no warning and no understanding of what is happening. The gas created a gap 4 miles wide. For a brief, terrifying moment, the Germans could have changed the outcome of the war. They didn't advance. German commanders hadn't expected the gas to work that well. They were not prepared to exploit the breakthrough. The moment passed. The gap was filled, and the war ground on. But gas warfare had begun. Every soldier had to carry a gas mask, had to sleep with a gas mask, had to know, at any moment, the wind could shift, and something invisible and odorless might be drifting toward them. After chlorine came phosgene, a colorless gas that smelled faintly of freshly cut hay, responsible for 80 to 85% of all gas deaths. And after phosgene came the most feared of all, mustard gas. Mustard gas was not designed to kill quickly. It was designed to incapacitate, to blind, to burn. Mustard gas attacked the skin, the eyes, the respiratory system. It caused massive blisters, inside the throat, inside the lungs, on every inch of exposed skin. It could penetrate clothing. It settled into the soil of the trenches and remained active for days. So, even after an attack, men walking through the area would be contaminated. It was not a fast death. It was a slow, agonizing, humiliating destruction of the human body. One British nurse, Vera Brittain, described treating mustard gas casualties. She wrote that the men's eyes were glued shut. Their skin was covered in yellow blisters. They could not see. They could barely breathe. They could not be touched without causing them agony, and most of them were 18, 19, 20 years old. This was World War I, not the version in the textbook. This version, the rats and the mud, and the gas and the broken mines. We haven't even gotten to the part yet that most people consider the defining horror of this war, the big push, the day they sent 60,000 men over the top in a single morning. That is coming in Part 3. Part 3. The Reckoning. The Somme, the Human Cost, Legacy, Emotional Ending. July 1st, 1916. 11:30 in the morning, along a 25-mile stretch of the Western Front, near a river called the Somme. British and Allied commanders have been planning the largest military offensive in history. For 7 days straight, Allied artillery has been bombarding the German trenches. Over 1.5 million shells fired in 1 week. The plan is simple. The commanders believe the bombardment has destroyed the German defenses, has cut the barbed wire, has killed or demoralized the German soldiers. The plan is for the infantry to simply walk forward. Walk, not run. Walk, because the commanders are so confident that the German defenses are destroyed. They actually tell their men not to rush, to walk in organized lines, to maintain formation. At exactly 7:30 a.m., 100,000 British soldiers climb out of their trenches and begin to walk toward the German lines. The German defenses were not destroyed. The German soldiers had survived the bombardment in deep concrete bunkers, some 30 feet underground. When the British artillery stopped, those soldiers came up from their bunkers, set up their machine guns, and waited. And when 100,000 British soldiers began walking slowly across no man's land in organized rows, the German machine gunners simply opened fire. By the end of that single day, July 1st, 1916, the British Army had suffered 57,470 casualties. 19,240 of those men were dead. In 1 day, it remains the single bloodiest day in British Army history, and the Battle of the Somme, which had just begun, would continue for another 141 days. By the time it ended, in November 1916, over 1 million men on both sides had been killed or wounded, and the front line had moved, at its deepest point, about 7 miles. 7 miles. 1 million casualties, 7 miles. There is a town in England called Accrington. It is a small town in Lancashire. Population, in 1916, of about 45,000 people. Accrington had formed what was called a PALS battalion, a unit made up entirely of men from the same town, the same community. Friends, brothers, neighbors, co-workers, all fighting together. The idea was that men would fight harder if they were beside people they knew. On July 1st, 1916, the Accrington PALs went over the top at the Battle of the Somme. Of the 720 men who went over that morning, 584 were killed or wounded within the first 30 minutes. 30 minutes. The news reached Accrington within days, and people described the town as simply going quiet. Entire streets where every family had lost someone. The local newspaper did not run stories about victory. It ran lists of names, column after column of names, boys that everyone in town recognized. That was happening in towns across England, across France, across Germany, across every nation, an entire generation gone. Now I want to tell you about one soldier, one specific man, because history is not just numbers. History is people. His name was Wilfred Owen. He was a poet from Shropshire, England. He was 22 years old when he arrived at the Western Front, and what he saw there changed him so completely, broke him so completely, that he was evacuated to a military hospital in Scotland, diagnosed with shell shock. At that hospital, he met an older poet named Siegfried Sassoon, and Sassoon told him, "Write it down. Everything you saw. Write it down so the people at home understand what is actually happening, what this war actually is." And Owen wrote. He wrote some of the most devastating war poetry in the English language. He wrote about men dying in gas attacks, their white eyes writhing in their faces. He wrote about the faces of dead soldiers in the mud. He wrote about the lie, the beautiful, comfortable lie, that it was noble and glorious and sweet to die for your country. He called that lie, in Latin, dulce et decorum est, sweet and noble, and he spent his poems destroying it, line by line. Wilfred Owen returned to the Western Front in 1918. He wanted to be with his men. He felt he could not stay safe while they were suffering. On November 4th, 1918, just 1 week before the war ended, Wilfred Owen was killed in action while leading his men across a canal in France. He was 25 years old. His parents received the telegram informing them of his death on November 11th, the day the war ended. The church bells were ringing for peace in the streets outside their house when the telegram arrived. The war ended on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918. At 11 a.m., the guns went quiet. After 4 years, 3 months, and 14 days, silence returned to the Western Front. Soldiers described not knowing what to do with the silence. Some cried, some laughed, some just sat in the mud and stared at nothing. One British soldier wrote that the silence felt wrong, that after years of constant artillery, the quiet seemed louder than the guns, and when the surviving soldiers came home, they came home changed, permanently, irreversibly changed. Men who had gone away as cheerful teenagers came back as old men at 22. Many could not talk about what they had seen, not to their wives, not to their parents, not to anyone. They carried it inside them. Some drank to forget. Some could not hold jobs. Some could not sleep without screaming. Some killed themselves years later, unable to outrun what they had seen. The world called it the war to end all wars. They built monuments. They held parades. They promised, never again. It will never happen again. The sacrifice of these men will be the last great sacrifice. The world has learned its lesson. 21 years later, World War II began. Here is what I want you to take away from this. Not dates, not troop numbers, not strategic maps. I want you to remember that every single number you heard today, every statistic, was a person. Was a 19-year-old kid with a family in a hometown and a future that was taken from him. Was a mother who got a telegram. Was a father who kept his son's room exactly as it was, for the rest of his life because he could not bring himself to change it. Was a sister who kept writing letters to an address in France, not knowing yet that there was no one left to read them. World War I did not happen because of one assassination. It happened because of pride, because of empire, because of leaders who sat in comfortable rooms and moved soldiers on maps like pieces on a game board, without ever standing in the mud themselves, without ever smelling what the trenches smelled like, without ever looking a dying 18-year-old in the face and explaining to him why this was worth it. The soldiers of World War I deserved better. They deserved leaders who understood what they were asking. They deserved a world that learned from their sacrifice. We owe them, at the very least, the truth about what they went through, and we owe them our memory. If this video moved you, if you felt even a fraction of what those soldiers felt, then share it. Let someone else know this story. Hit subscribe because next week we are going inside another chapter of history. That the textbooks buried. And leave me a comment. Tell me which part of this story hit you hardest. This has been your History Channel. I will see you next week.